Well, thank you, Hassan, and good evening, everyone. As Hassan said, I'm Peter Wibberley. I'm a scientist in the National Timescale Group in the Time and Frequency Department at the National Physical Laboratory, located down in Teddington in southwest London, not too far from here. And in this short talk, I'm going to talk firstly about timekeeping over the recent centuries, very briefly, just to provide some context, and explain why timekeeping is now done by an organisation like the National Physical Laboratory, NPL, rather than by an astronomical institute. And then I'll say briefly how we go about keeping time today at NPL. So, of course, if you want to keep time, the best way is to use a clock of some sort. A clock, essentially, is a device that counts oscillations of some sort of periodic or repeating event. For example, here, a pendulum clock. The oscillator is a swinging pendulum, but, of course, all pendulum clocks are slightly different, and historically, we've always referenced clocks to the Earth's rotation, and we adjust the clock to keep it in step with the Earth's rotation. In addition, a clock needs a counter. It needs some way to count the oscillations and provide a display for anyone who wants to know what the time actually is. And of course, once you have a clock, you can start to divide the day down into more useful intervals. So historically, we have hours, minutes, seconds. More recently, we've subdivided the second into smaller and smaller fractions just by dividing by 1,000 each time. So we have milliseconds, 1,000th of a second, then microseconds, nanoseconds, picoseconds. So I'll talk later about nanoseconds quite a lot, which are billionths of a second. So once we have clocks, how do we go about making a timescale? We really have to have some way of establishing rules for keeping time. A clock itself will just tell you the time interval between two events. But to know exactly what the time is, you've got to have rules for deciding how you go about assigning time to events. And that was done historically by astronomers who observed the motions of the Earth's rotation on its axis, and generated a timescale called mean solar time, which is based on the Earth's rotation, the length of the day. And the term mean solar time means that you have to average it over a year. It turns out the Earth's rotation isn't perfectly uniform because the Earth's axis is elliptical rather than circular, and because the Earth's axis is tilted, it's not perpendicular to the orbit. And so you have to look over a full year to really align your clock accurately with solar time. But once you've done that, you have a smooth timescale reference to the Earth, and the Greenwich Observatory you see here generated Greenwich Mean Time. And that was used primarily, of course, to generate tables for navigators, but it did make time available to anyone who could actually see the observatory. You can see on top of the observatory there was a mast with a time ball on it, which was dropped at 1 p.m. every day. So anyone who could see that could set their clock to the correct time. But around the country, of course, you didn't have access to Greenwich time until probably in the middle of the 19th century. So each town, each factory would keep its own local time. And they did that just by using a sundial to set a clock to roughly the correct time, typically within minutes at best, usually tens of minutes. And so every town had its own local time. As you went east or west of Greenwich, the time would vary. And for example, here you can see the clock on the Bristol Corn Exchange, which actually has 2 minute hands on it. The red hand gives you Greenwich time, and the black hand gives you Bristol time, which was 11 minutes behind. But that isn't a very practical way of keeping time, and as the railways spread around the country, it became more and more important to have a standard time. So by the 1840s, the railways began to adopt Greenwich time, and that was adopted formally as railway time in 1847. And soon after that as well, it became possible to disseminate Greenwich time around the country more accurately using electric telegraphs. And this situation was formalized in 1880 when legislation adopted Greenwich Mean Time as the standard time for the UK. And of course, timekeeping started to be coordinated more and more worldwide as well. And in particular, the 1884 International Meridian Conference, held in Washington, D.C. in the USA, came up with some key resolutions. It adopted Greenwich as the prime meridian, zero longitude for the world, and that became the reference for all maritime charts. It also recommended that Greenwich Mean Time should be used as a reference time for the world. That resolution actually took several decades to be fully adopted around the world. But a third recommendation was the time zone system you can see in the chart here, where individual countries choose to set their time by a whole number of hours ahead of or behind Greenwich time, which makes keeping time far easier as you move from one country to another. In fact, Greenwich Mean Time didn't exist for very long as the world's time. It officially was renamed back in 1928. And the reason for that is historically astronomers measured time of day from midday to midday, which is, of course, 12 hours different to the normal civilian usage. They eventually decided in 1925 to change their timekeeping and to change the date at midnight, like everyone else, and then they decided they needed to have a new name for Greenwich Mean Time, so it wouldn't be confused with the old version. And the name they eventually adopted was Universal Time, UT. So just as a quick question here, how many people have heard of Greenwich Mean Time? I think that's probably everybody. How many of you have heard of Universal Time? A fair number, but not much more than half, maybe. So the new name didn't really catch on all that well in English-speaking countries, but it is widely used in other countries around the world. But officially we have Universal Time to replace Greenwich Mean Time since 1928. But it soon turned out that Universal Time actually has some big problems. It was clear by the 1930s that the Earth isn't a perfect timekeeper. Its rotation rate varies, it speeds up and slows down unpredictably, mainly due to changes in the Earth's molten core. And also the Earth's axis of rotation isn't fixed rigidly relative to the Earth's surface. It moves around, so the pole appears to move over an area of several meters in radius. And these two effects cause errors in timekeeping. So new timescales, new versions of universal time were introduced to try to deal with this problem. UT0 was the observed mean solar time. UT1 is UT0 corrected for the polar wander. And also UT2 then takes out seasonal variations, to some extent at least. It wasn't done perfectly. And of these timescales, only UT1 is still used today, because that's the timescale that anyone doing celestial navigation needs. It's also the timescale that you need to reference if you want to point a telescope at a particular object in the sky. So UT1 is effectively the modern form of Greenwich Mean Time. But even despite all these attempts to create a better timescale, there was still a big problem, and that's that the Earth's rotation over the long term is gradually slowing down due to an effect called tidal friction. The motions of the tides around the Earth cause friction, which takes up Earth's rotational energy, turns it into heat, and causes a gradual slowing down. So the second of universal time was never going to be a constant. So to get around that problem, astronomers came up with a new timescale called ephemeris time. This was a really difficult timescale to access because it was based on mathematical models of the solar system. And it was not really suitable for practical usage. But it was important in that, firstly, it established a principle that it was more important to have a constant value for the second than to have a second which was directly related to the Earth's rotation. And secondly, it established a new definition for the second. And this definition was actually adopted into the International System of Units in 1960, the SI, for the first time. That was the first time we had a formal definition that was in line with all of the other units of measurement. However, the ephemeris second was soon overtaken by events, and that event was the development of really practical atomic clocks. And the photo here shows the first cesium atomic clock, which came into use at MPL in 1955. And this clock was really the first practical atomic clock. It was important because, firstly, it was the first clock which was much better at timekeeping, more stable than the Earth's rotation itself. And secondly, because it was based on atoms. If you look at the old model of a clock, the reference was the Earth's rotation, and clocks were always aligned in frequency with the Earth's rotation. Now, with the cesium atomic clock, it's the atoms themselves, the cesium atoms inside the clock, which are the reference. Those atoms are probed with microwave radiation, and the cesium atoms normally exist in one of two states. In fact, if we go back to the previous picture, on the left here we have a cesium oven which generates a beam of atoms which shoots through the clock from left to right. And the atoms pass through a magnet. So the atoms coming out of the oven are in two energy states separated by about 9.2 gigahertz. The magnet just to the right of the oven takes out some of those atoms in one of the states, Atoms in the other state pass through the microwave field in the center of the clock. And the microwaves probe the atoms and cause some of them to change to the other energy state, but only when the microwaves are on precisely the right frequency. The atoms then pass through a second magnet, which discards the atoms in the original state, so then hit a detector which counts how many have changed state. And by adjusting the measured signal to maximize the number changing state, we can lock the microwave signal onto precisely the frequency that corresponds to that transition in the cesium atom. So what's so important now is that we have a clock which is self-contained. The reference is inside the clock. We no longer have to refer to anything else. What's more important, perhaps, is that that reference is a fundamental constant of nature. The cesium atom transition frequency will always be the same. It won't change over time, or so we believe. And one final benefit is that because this is a much higher frequency oscillator, around 10 gigahertz, that's very much faster than the oscillator in most other types of clock. And that allowed the clock to perform better, to be a more stable clock. So having built the first cesium clock, we then had to work out what its frequency was. We knew roughly what it was, you could tune the microwaves onto it, but what was the precise value of that frequency? So that first cesium clock at MPL was actually compared with the ephemeris second, which was measured by the US Naval Observatory in Washington, DC. And those two different times were compared by transatlantic radio signals. And the result of this 3-year campaign was the number you see here, that the cesium frequency was 192.631.770 plus or minus 20 cycles per second. And that number became adopted as the new definition of the second in 1967, only 7 years after the ephemeris second was adopted. It was clear by that point that the cesium clock was a vastly better way of keeping time than the ephemeris time. And that number is still in use today. That number is still the definition of the second more than 50 years later. So how do we go about generating timescales, having built these new high-performance clocks? The simplest way, of course, is simply to count the atomic seconds. And so institutes around the world started to build new cesium clocks and to just generate their own local atomic timescales. Very quickly, of course, these institutes started to coordinate their activities and to combine their timescales. And what's now called international atomic time began to be formed. And that's really just time formed by counting atomic seconds. It's now done as a sort of combination of clocks around the world. But a second timescale was needed, and that was called Coordinated Universal Time, UTC. And UTC is really the reference timescale for the whole world. And UTC is atomic time, but adjusted to keep it in step with time based on the Earth's rotation, with UT1. So just as another question, how many of you have heard of Coordinated Universal Time? That's good. Good proportion of you. It's actually not that well known, and many media, for example, still refer to Greenwich Mean Time, when strictly speaking they mean UTC. UTC is actually computed by the organisation in the photo, the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, which is based in Paris. But that's an international organisation which has no clocks of its own. It relies on institutes around the world. So if we look at how UTC is generated, there are something like 80 different national timing centres which maintain their own versions of UTC. And these are known as UTC-K timescales, where K represents the acronym for that organisation. So, for example, in the UK, we have UTC-NPL. And together, these organisations have around 400 continuously running clocks. These are just commercial clocks, all atomic clocks. And the BIPM takes measurements from those clocks and averages them together to form a smooth average timescale called free atomic time. And they then adjust the frequency of that timescale using a small number of cesium primary standards. These are the latest generation of the cesium clock that was built in 1955. And the result is what's called international atomic time, which is an atomic timescale formed by counting atomic seconds. But we then adjust TAI, atomic time, using 1 second adjustments when needed to keep UTC, Coordinated Universal Time, in step with the Earth's rotation. And that's measured by another organisation, the IERS, International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service. And as a final step, the BIPM publishes a monthly report called Circular T, which feeds back information to the national timing centres to allow them to adjust their timescales. That report's actually freely available. It's on the internet. But that's an important feedback that really allows all of these different national timescales to be kept in close alignment. So how do we actually keep time nowadays at MPL? We have a number of different types of clock. On the left, you see the cesium fountain. We have a cesium fountain primary standard, which is the latest generation of cesium clock, which can keep time to around a second in 150 million years. But that clock is a large, complex laboratory system. It doesn't run continuously. So we have a number of other clocks which provide the flywheel, the continuous reference for our timescale. And these are a type of clock called hydrogen masers. So they're atomic clocks using hydrogen atoms. And these are very stable and highly reliable types of clock. We had one clock at MPL which failed a couple of years ago after running continuously for 29 years. And so they're not perfect. They do slowly drift in frequency over time, and we use the cesium fountain to adjust the frequency of the masers to keep them on precisely the SI second. And of course, if you're generating a timescale by counting seconds generated by your clocks, you've really got to ensure that your clocks never fail. So at MPL, we generate 3 different realizations of UTC MPL, which are kept in very close alignment. And the UTC MPL, using this procedure, can be kept within 5 nanoseconds, 5 billionths of a second of UTC continuously. One final point on this slide, on the right, you see that we have what are called time transfer links, and these are mechanisms to compare our timescale with those in other countries. And this is done using 2 different techniques. One is by comparing UTC MPL with the clocks carried by GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite System satellites, such as the GPS satellites. And by measuring UTC MPL against the satellite clocks and then comparing those measurements with those taken in other locations, we can actually compare the 2 timescales on the ground within a nanosecond or 2. And the second method involves exchanging timing signals via a geostationary communication satellite. And again, if we send signals 2 ways, from one lab to another and back the other way at the same time, the delays to the satellite and the ground cancel out, and we can compare the 2 timescales to within about a nanosecond. And we also have to disseminate time from MPL, and we have a number of different methods to do that. We have a radio signal called MSF, broadcast from Anthorn in Cumbria. That service synchronizes several million clocks around the UK. It's not a high accuracy service, but it's available free of charge and is widely used just to provide time of day. We also provide time over the internet using a protocol called NTP, Network Time Protocol. And we have a higher performance service for the financial sector called NPL Time, which disseminates time through optical fiber links to financial organizations. So in summary, today UTC is the reference timescale in use worldwide. In the UK, it's MPL, National Physical Laboratory, that maintains the UK's national timescale, UTC MPL, which is our physical realization of UTC. And just as a reminder, UTC is actually a combination timescale. It's based on atomic clocks, it has the stability of atomic clocks and gives us the SI second, but at the same time, it also has a link at present to the Earth's rotation, to mean solar time, or UT1. And the picture here shows the current operational cesium fountain, the current generation of primary standard at MPL, to give you an idea of the complexity of these systems. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Eleanor, who's going to tell you more about the MPL Time service.
It's an absolute pleasure and a real honor to be here with you tonight. And thank you all for coming out to listen to the NPL lectures this evening. For the next 20 minutes or so, I will present to you how NPL uses our expertise in time and frequency to support the finance sector with a service that we call NPL Time. My name is Eleanor Parsons, and I'm a Strategic Business Development Manager within the partnerships team at NPL with a focus on timing services. And it had to happen to me. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, so let's start again. Let me breathe. As you know, for more than 100 years, NPL has been using the metrology, the science of measurement, to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of science and therefore increase confidence in its output. NPL works within 4 strategic challenges which align with the current and future requirements for the UK. The NPL time service that I will discuss with you today falls within the security and resilience challenge, which aims to support the UK's need to manage risk to national security and resilient infrastructure. Let's try again. Before we go any further, though, I would like to take you back in time, and more specifically to May 6, 2010. Now, for those of us who have a hard time remembering what we had dinner last night, let alone what happened over 13 years ago, let me help remind you a little bit. So, on May 6, 2010, it was general election in the UK. Wall Street in the US was feeling slightly anxious about the increasing debt crisis in Greece, and the euro was falling against the dollar. But despite the somewhat turbulent start to the trading day, no one expected what happened next. In a sequence of events that later became known as flash crash, US equity market dropped by approximately 900 points, lost roughly 800 billion worth of its value, and managed to regain its value back to the original state within half an hour. This event, even though it was possibly the most famous one, it wasn't the only one that eroded significantly confidence in the financial sector. It eventually transpired that the cause of these incidents were high-frequency trading companies, or HFTs, who use computer algorithms to perform a large amount of transactions at a very speedy pace. The sector quickly realized that accurate timestamps are necessary for market clarity, order of execution, so who does what when, and forensic analysis of trading events. In addition to that, at the time, the default mechanism for financial institutions to access time was through Global Navigation Satellite Systems, or GNSS, which basically involved the deployment of an antenna on the ground to access a timing signal from a satellite constellation. The most famous and probably the most used of these satellite constellations is the Global Positioning System, or GPS. The mechanism works perfectly fine, but it poses significant challenges for financial institutions. For example, lack of roof access in the buildings in the center of London, failures in infrastructure due to loss of the signal, or interference of antennas due to close proximity to one another. So what did NPL do as a result of these events? In the UK, Sir John Beddington commissioned the report on future of computer trading for the global finance sector. The report was published in 2012, and the recommendation from the report was the introduction of high accuracy, traceable timestamps for high frequency trading companies, as well as standard development. NPL led the discussion with the Foresight team and the Financial Services Authority, or the current Financial Conduct Authority, to develop an understanding of the use of time in the finance sector. In 2013, together with the New York stock exchange, we did a trial using fiber links from our lab in Teddington all the way to the City of London to trial an alternative mechanism to GNSS-based timing, and we published a white paper to highlight the importance of time for the sector. We continued engaging with the regulators, both here in the UK as well as at the European level. In 2016, we partnered with the Canadian Stock Exchange, TMX, to do a trial with UBS. UBS is the 5th largest bank in Europe, and we published a white paper. UBS became the first commercial customer of what is now called NPL Time Service, which was launched by NPL in 2017 together with the Intercontinental Exchange. So it goes on. In a sequel to the Market in Financial Instruments Directive, or MiFID I, came into effect in January 2018 and was somewhat uncreatively called MiFID II. For the first time, the directive included a regulatory technical standard on clock synchronization. And more recently and currently, we are actively engaging with the FCA to support the development of the of an equivalent to the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is an EU regulation that aims to support financial organizations increase their resilience against ICT-related and cybersecurity incidents. But let's have a look a little bit closer to MiFID II. Now, the directive itself is 196 pages long, but ultimately, RTS 25, that refers specifically to clock synchronization, makes 3 requirements of high-frequency traders. 1, that they use UTC as their reference time. 2, that they achieve a level of accuracy for timestamps of business transactions with a maximum offset of 100 microseconds to UTC, and 3, that they establish a record of traceability to UTC. Importantly, financial institutions have to have proof of evidence of traceability by keeping a record of the specification, design, and what equipment they use. This was a difficult ask by the regulator to the financial institutions, which at that point knew very little about clock synchronization. So we had a look at the reasons why change was needed in the sector. We had a look at how NPL, right from the start, got involved with awareness raising around time, standards development, and we had a look at how the regulator stepped in to create new standards for the sector. What I'd like to finish at the end is for us to have a look at how NPL time helps institutions, financial institutions, meet those requirements. So, as we said, one of the main requirements by MiFID II was traceability to UTC. The concept of traceability for a time measurement requires a constant chain of comparisons, extending from the generation of a timestamp all the way back through the time distribution to one of the national timescales, UTC-K. Now, in the pyramid on the slide, you see how NPL time is traceable to the UK's national timescale, which, as my colleague Peter explained previously, is UTC-NPL. In order to determine the combined level of uncertainty within a traceability chain, we have to determine the uncertainty of each link within that chain. And that can be achieved by doing a calibration. As part of the NPL time service, NPL calibrates the time server at the end of the time distribution using a cesium atomic clock, which has been referenced to UTC NPL. After calibration, NPL issues a document to certify that that specific time server is traceable to UTC and has a maximum offset of 1 microsecond from UTC NPL, well within the 100 microsecond requirement by MiFID. However, it is not sufficient to establish the uncertainty value unless we are able to demonstrate that that remains unchanged over time. In order to do that, NPL monitors the timing infrastructure from the generation of UTC NPL all the way to the calibrated time server continuously, 24/7, and keeps a record of all the monitoring data for 7 years, which is another requirement by MiFID II, thus enabling auditing of the data upon request in the future. To finish, even though MiFID II does not specify what mechanism should be used to access time, NPL time is GNSS independent, and therefore mitigates all the risks associated by using a GNSS time-based timing. The design itself includes further resilient elements that mitigate against risks like hardware failure or intentional or accidental damage to the links between the time source and the time server. NPL time is delivered to finance customers at the moment, together with our delivery partners, the Intercontinental Exchange and Telehouse data center. I will finish with this. UBS was the first commercial customer of NPL time, but we are currently supporting a significant number of financial institutions in the City of London. NPL time is only one example, and within a specific sector, that demonstrates how NPL partners with external organizations to respond to industry challenges that arise as a result either of new technologies or geopolitical developments that may pose a risk to the UK's financial and maybe social stability. My colleagues from the other challenges, I'm sure, have many more examples just like that. Thank you. And I will pass now to Leon Lobo, head of the National Timing Center, and my boss.
Thank you, Elena. It's a privilege to be here today in such an amazing venue. But I'm going to talk a little bit about resilient time for our future and what does that mean? So with a show of hands, how many of you use a sat-nav device either on your phone or in your car to get here today? Quite a significant number. How many of you before today knew that GNSS was based on time and delivers time? Excellent, excellent. Now that's a really, really important piece because not only is the global navigation satellite systems based on time themselves, so you get your positioning based on timing signals, but it's the means of choice across the globe to a large extent to access time. And that with it comes a huge problem as well. So GNSS provides PNT services. PNT is position, navigation, and time. Now, one of the key things, particularly that timing element, it's very much an invisible utility. You see your positioning capability on your sat-nav, in your car, on your phone, but the timing element is embedded everywhere that there is a digital infrastructure. So every one of our 13 critical national infrastructure sectors in the UK are dependent in some form or the other on GNSS for time and synchronization. One of the big problems we've got is that no sector operates in isolation. They're all very much dependent on each other. Everyone's dependent on energy and power, as well as comms and finance. But till today, and again, from a show of hands, did you know that if we lost GNSS, it would cost the UK £1 billion per day over a 7-day period? And that's very significant when you consider that. And that's really the cost of us having done nothing to mitigate it. Now, you've heard previously as well the element around the US Naval Observatory. GNSS really, and GPS, is a means of disseminating time rather than a source of time. It, in itself, gets its time from a UTC-K lab, in this case, the US Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. Now, that's an important piece because the embedded nature of this invisible utility everywhere and the threat and vulnerability of these signals, the analogy here is the GPS signal strength is the equivalent of a light bulb on the moon. That's the level on the surface of the Earth. As soon as you broadcast any signal in the same band as GNSS, you swamp it. This map here essentially shows the global outages that we are experiencing on a daily and weekly basis. You can see there's a high concentration around some crisis areas at the moment, like the Black Sea, Ukraine, Russia, the Nordics. This device will take out the tracker in your vehicle, costs $8 of Amazon. Yeah? Take out the tracker in your vehicle. I've got some props here, which is... this one is a little bit more significant. Not only takes out your GPS receiver, as well as GPS receivers in the surrounding area, but all your comm signals as well. This one is even more significant now. I've lost a few antennas. These are illegal to operate mine, so I won't turn them on. This is what's happening currently on a daily basis with the current crisis that we have. So it's not a problem for someone else. This challenge is by no means just local. It's a global issue, and the dependence needs to be addressed and some mitigation put in place. So just looking at the timeline, we started looking at the dependence, and really it was the lack of awareness of the dependence that was highlighted in the Blackett report back in 2018. So what did we do about it? NPL, with other government organizations, set up what is now the National Timing Center program to start to put in place the mitigations for that. Moving on, we had the National Risk Register back in 2020, which was really about, for the first time, starting to raise the piece around, timing loss being an important piece to consider, but no specific risk around PNT. But then we were all hit by COVID. But that, not only were we all affected personally in all sorts of ways, it massively, massively increased our dependency on our digital infrastructure. It massively ramped up the evolution of our digital infrastructure, and our dependency hasn't gone down since then. This is the crisis then hit, and that's the GNSS outage in the area. Then we had a new National Risk Register as of 2 months ago, which for the first time raised PNT as a standalone risk. Previously, it was sort of embedded in space weather, but it needs to be a standalone risk so that we can start to address it formally. And unfortunately, we are seeing more outages because of the current crisis as well. Should that come home, we may have a problem because we don't necessarily have the mechanisms in place to mitigate against it. Now, this is a really important one, and it came out last week. So for the first time, the UK has put forward a policy framework to put in place a PNT resilient capability for the UK. It's a 10-point plan, effectively, and it's worth looking at. If you're interested in position, navigation, and timing, it's quite important because it sort of lays out what we shall be doing over the next 10, 15 years and what sort of technologies we'll start to develop to make sure that we are resilient for the future. So the National Timing Center program, which is currently in the 5th year of 6 years, we have 3 primary objectives. One is around resilience, so essentially securing what you heard before, the national timescale, UTC NPL, but doing it in a very different way, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but also starting to address the supply chain. So all the components that we use, the clocks, the dissemination systems, the user equipment, we have a major problem on a global scale for any timing infrastructure where we have very, very few suppliers in this space. And it's a question about how we start to develop capability in the UK and start to essentially have some diversity in that supply chain moving forward. And the final challenge, to make it even more complicated, is we have a very poor skills pipeline in this area of time, frequency, and synchronization. So it's starting to consider how we address that as well moving forward. So what are we doing on the resiliency front? So the resilient enhanced timescale infrastructure, which is effectively our new capability that we are building, is taking what we have as UTC NPL, building the next generation of that, but in a very different way. So we are putting it in place in multiple locations on secure sites, connected up with a range of different methods. And the aim is resilience through diversity, geographical and time transfer techniques with different failure modes, such that should any one site go down, we still have a capability in place. And that's a global first. It's never been done before. The next layer, this is my layers of the onions brief. The next layer out is really about distribution. It's about dissemination, because there's no point managing a timescale if you don't distribute it. The next layer out, as we see coming over the next several years, is some of it we are doing now, but this is about a more concerted effort to deliver into critical national infrastructure using different methods and essentially making sure it's secured as a government capability into what is going to be a system of systems approach to position, navigation, and timing systems for the UK moving forward. So delivering over fiber in the ground, delivering into radio broadcast transmit sites, delivering into space asset ground segments. Every low Earth orbit constellation that you've come across has an ambition for position, navigation, and timing services. But the last thing we should be doing is to create a new one only to be sourced from GNSS again and not mitigating the problem. So this is what we are thinking about for the future of the UK and beyond. And the key piece here is about not just the resiliency element, but embedding traceability into the entire system of systems. Because the next layer out, where industry picks up those signals, adds value, and delivers downstream, we can have essentially a sync platform for the UK, such that someone might be in the Shetland Islands accessing a radio signal and someone else in London over a fiber network, but they can be synchronized by virtue of understanding the uncertainty of the dissemination system that they have and are using. And that's never been considered before in that way. But the other element is, as this develops, you could have access to signals better than GPS. As we start to embed the next generation of optical clocks into that heartbeat, or that core, that is the resilient enhanced timescale infrastructure, You could have the next generation of signals without necessarily doing anything. And those are, so it's not just about the resiliency piece, it's about the opportunity perspective. And that in itself is going to create an entirely new ecosystem for the UK once we have this infrastructure starting to develop, build, the innovation, the sovereign supply chain, the skills pipeline developing. This being in itself the market for the systems that are going to be developed. This being essentially, you could almost say, the blueprint for resiliency for digital infrastructure globally. And that's where the UK has a significant leadership in what we are doing now in securing time in the background. It's still very much invisible, and we're keeping it at that for now. But moving on, it could be feeding all our critical national infrastructure digital systems. And who knows, as that infrastructure develops, does time become the 14th critical national infrastructure sector? It's a question. I'm not saying it's going to be, but who knows, like space. And PNT, in the future, T may not be that invisible utility in the background. It could be, as you have power and network at the wall, you might have time as that new utility for the UK and beyond. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Rachel Gordon, who's our science area lead at NPL on optical frequency metrology. I need to get this out of your way.
So hello, good evening, and it's such a pleasure to be here. So I'm Rachel Godin, and I'm a principal scientist in NPL's Time and Frequency department. Now, you've heard this evening already quite a bit about the importance of accurate and resilient timescales for our everyday lives. But how can we make sure that those timescales can continue to improve into the future? So for that, we need to make sure that the atomic clocks that underpin those timescales can continue to improve. And so NPL has a very active research and development program creating those next generation atomic clocks. And these are the so-called optical atomic clocks. And that's going to be the subject of this talk. So I want to cover sort of what are optical clocks. So there's a photograph up there from one of our laboratories, but that doesn't really help you understand how it works and why these clocks are so much better than the cesium clocks. So I want to go into a little bit more detail about that. I want to show you how accurate these clocks are, and as a metrologist, perhaps even more importantly, how can we be sure that they're as accurate as we think they are? And then finally, I want to show you that actually they're so accurate that we're going to need a new definition of the SI second. Right, so how do atomic clocks work? We've seen a little bit of this already, but let's go back through it again. So every clock needs something that ticks at a very regular rate. Now, in an atomic clock, the thing that's ticking or oscillating is a wave of electromagnetic radiation. So let's maybe use a little bit of imagination here. And we're going to think of this spring as being a wave of electromagnetic radiation. And so the coils on the spring here, these are representing the peaks and the troughs of the wave. And this could be a wave of microwaves, it could be a wave of light, some sort of electromagnetic wave. And so as it's oscillating, we can almost think of this as the ticking of the clock. This is the sort of tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock with every oscillation that we have. Now, we need to make sure that our clock is running at the right rate, that it's not ticking too fast or too slow. And so we need to tune this frequency to some sort of a reference. And that's where the atom comes in. So I've got an atom in my sink. Maybe we could just turn the lights down a little bit, if that's possible. Because what we want to be able to do is take advantage of the fact that atoms are a very good frequency reference. They have internal energy levels, and that means that you can excite an atom from one energy level to another when you expose it to electromagnetic radiation at a specific frequency, at the atom's resonant frequency. And so when you do that, you can excite the atom, but you've got to get the right frequency. So what we can do here is we can imagine that we're going to start with, let's say we've got a very high frequency here, And then we're going to try and tune this frequency until we can excite the atom. And so I'm going to gradually, in this case, reduce the frequency. And I'm tuning the frequency of my electromagnetic wave. And at some point, I'm going to hit the resonance. Maybe you can just see that. My atoms got very excited. Yeah. And so while the atom's excited, then that means we know that we've got just the right frequency in our electromagnetic wave. So we know we've tuned it in to a very specific frequency, so it's ticking at the right rate, the rate set by the atom. So I'm just going to leave that to tune now. See, it's no longer excited. Okay, so that's a generic atomic clock. So in the specific case of cesium, then the cesium atom, it's a microwave frequency that makes it resonate. So we'd need to shine microwaves onto the cesium atom. Now, we know that the second is defined based on that cesium transition frequency. And so the way that's done is simply by defining what that frequency is in hertz. So the number of oscillations per second is given by that number. That means that if we want to say when has 1 second elapsed, we need to count up the oscillations of the radiation that's tuned into the cesium atom. And when we've had exactly 9,192,631,770 oscillations, then we know that 1 second has elapsed. Okay, so that's our cesium clock. Now, what about optical atomic clocks? So, as the name suggests, optical atomic clocks rely on an optical frequency, so an optical frequency resonance within an atom. Now, I haven't labeled the atom as a particular element on this diagram, and that's because there are actually quite a few different elements that are being investigated. So there isn't really one clear winner yet, so lots of different elements. But what you can see here is that optical radiation is at a much higher frequency than the microwave radiation. And optical radiation, it can, of course, just be a laser beam. So in terms of frequencies, microwave frequencies might be at a few gigahertz, but optical frequencies are a few hundred terahertz. So we're really looking at 5 orders of magnitude higher frequency in an optical clock. And that's important because what that means is that we now have more ticks per second from an optical clock compared to a cesium clock. And if you've got more ticks per second, it becomes much easier to measure an interval of time more precisely. And that's really at the heart of how optical clocks can perform so much better than the cesium clocks. So I've started to talk about performance of the clocks. So let's have a look on a graph and see just how well these clocks are performing. So this plot here on the vertical axis, that's showing the fractional uncertainty that the clocks achieve. And it's plotted on the x-axis, that's about the last sort of 70 years. And so starting in the top left, the first point there is the 1955 clock pictured in the black and white photo from Essen and Parry. And that clock could measure 1 second to a part in 10 to the 10. But over the years, the technology has improved, and the clocks have been improving at almost an order of magnitude every decade. And so on the right, we see in the color photograph NPL's cesium fountain clock that currently underpins the UK's timescale. And that's operating with an uncertainty of a part in 10 to the 16, a couple of parts in 10 to the 16. So hugely impressive progress that's been made over the years in the performance of the atomic clocks. But that's the cesium clocks. And here are the optical clocks, shown in green and red. And okay, you can immediately see that they've made much faster progress. And you'll also spot that there are lots of element labels on those green and red points. And that's because, as I mentioned before, there are lots of different types of optical clock under development. So you can see strontium, ytterbium, aluminium, mercury. There's quite a few different elements that are being studied. Now, the significance of the red points is that those are the systems where the performance has gone beyond that of the cesium clocks. And in fact, if you look, you can see that the very best optical clocks are now reaching uncertainties of a part in 10 to the 18. And so the best optical clocks are now performing 100 times better than the cesium clocks. And that's really significant because we've been defining the second and realizing the second with cesium clocks, But we now have other systems that are capable of going 100 times better than the primary standard. And so it's these systems in red which are really screaming out for a redefinition of the second. But we'll come on to that in a minute. So I'm saying that the very best optical clocks here are reaching a part in 10 to the 18. So let's just sort of think about what that means. So measuring to a part in 10 to the 18, it's like being able to measure 1 second to the 18th decimal place. And so, I can write that out, and that's a lot of zeros. But it's hard to really kind of have an impression of just how impressive that performance is. So I've got a couple of examples to try and help us think about that. So a part in 10 to the 18 would be equivalent to measuring the age of the universe, so 14 billion years, to the nearest half a second. Or if you prefer a length analogy, it's the equivalent of measuring the distance to the moon to within the diameter of an atom. Okay, so it's really, truly impressive to be able to reach these part in 10 to the 18 precision. So at NPL, we actually have the only operational optical clocks in the UK. And we have systems based on strontium and ytterbium ion. So you notice we've got both neutral atoms there and singly charged ions. It's possible to have optical clocks based on both. And it's particularly nice to be able to mention strontium whilst I'm standing here at the Royal Institution, because actually strontium was first isolated here in 1808 by the chemist Humphrey Davy. So that's a nice piece of connection with history there. Okay, so people sometimes say, well, what do you have to actually do in the lab to reach these impressive levels of precision? And of course, I can't put it all onto one slide, but I just wanted to give sort of 3 highlights for some of the special precautions we have to take in the lab. And so this is an example from our ytterbium ion optical clock, which is photographed. And we actually trap just a single atom of ytterbium. In fact, we ionize it, so it's a charged ion of ytterbium, but just one. And we trap that at the center of a vacuum system. So in the photograph, there's a vacuum chamber, lots of electrodes, copper you can see in the middle. So right in the middle of that is just a single isolated ion of ytterbium. And in the top right, the picture is showing an image of the fluorescence from that single atom when we're shining laser light onto it. Now, the advantage of having just a single atom trapped in the vacuum system means that we can control its environment quite well. We know exactly where it is. It's not being bumped into by lots of other atoms. So it makes a very good, isolated atomic reference. It's also very important that the atom isn't moving around too much. So if the atom's very hot and it has a lot of thermal kinetic energy, that motion means you're going to end up with Doppler shifts. And it means that your atomic reference frequency is going to look like it's modified. So we want to remove all that motion from the atom. So we need to cool it down. And we use a process called laser cooling, and it enables us to cool our atom to within 1,000th of a degree above absolute zero. So this is an incredibly cold temperature that we can trap this atom with. Another thing that we need to take care of is we have to very carefully characterize all the background electric and magnetic fields. We want to make sure that any possible frequency shifts, changes in those energy levels within the atom are all taken care of and accounted for, so that we can be sure that the frequency reference from our atom is exactly what we expect it to be. Okay, so we've made clocks that we believe are operating at the low parts in 10 to the 18, but how can we be sure? So you might think, well, just measure the frequency of your clock. What frequency is it in hertz? Is it giving you the right answer? And the problem with that is that to measure a frequency in units of hertz means we need to measure it relative to a realization of 1 hertz. That means measuring it relative to a cesium clock. We've already seen that the very best cesium clocks are only good to a part in 10 to the 16. So if we measure an optical clock relative to cesium, we can't get a measure better than a part in 10 to the 16. So that's not going to be any good for us to try and demonstrate that we've achieved a part in 10 to the 18. So our only option really is to compare an optical clock against another optical clock. But I've already said that we've got the only clocks in the UK that are operating at that level. So we're going to have to compare it with an optical clock in another country. So we're going to compare in another country. We could make use of satellite links. And in fact, we already use satellite links to link up all the cesium clocks that are in the international timescale. The problem here, though, is that the satellite links themselves introduce uncertainty into the measurement at the level of about a part in 10 to the 16. So again, it's not going to enable us to compare these clocks at the part in 10 to the 18 level. Now, luckily, optical fiber links do allow us to reach those uncertainty levels. And so if we can have optical fiber links between the clocks, that will enable us to compare at the 10 to the minus 18 and beyond level. We're very lucky at NPL. Actually, we have an optical fiber link that goes through to Paris, and then it goes on from Paris to in Germany and Italy. So it's allowing us to compare against optical clocks across Europe. And so we've actually been doing international comparisons, and we've demonstrated that the optical clocks really do have better accuracy and stability than cesium. So this really is now time to plan for a redefinition of the SI second. Right, but before you go about changing the definition of an SI unit, you've got to really make sure that you've got full international agreement on this. You can't just enter into this lightly. A lot of work is going on in this area at the moment in the metrology community, and we're hoping to be ready to redefine the second by 2030. But how will we know when we're actually ready to redefine? So a roadmap has been set out, and we've agreed on 8 mandatory criteria, and each of these criteria have milestones associated with them. When we've ticked off all those milestones, we'll know that we're ready to redefine. So just to give you a flavour of some of that work, I'm just going to quickly run through what those milestones are. So the first 3 all are related to making very careful measurements of the uncertainty of the clocks, a bit like I've been describing. So for example, there's an accuracy target that says we need to assess the uncertainty of the clocks to better than 2 parts in 10 to the 18. Then there's a verification stage. It says we need to be able to compare the optical clocks against other optical clocks at better than 5 parts in 10 to the 18. And we also need to make sure that if we redefine the second based on an optical transition frequency, we want it to match up with the value of 1 second defined through cesium. So that means we need to make sure that there's no discontinuity at the point of redefinition. So to achieve that, we need to be measuring our optical clocks relative to cesium clocks, and the target is to do that better than 3 parts in 10 to the 16. Now, the next 3 criteria are all related to incorporating optical clocks into international timescales, because, of course, it's no good just having wonderful clocks. We actually want to make timescales out of these. So we need to make regular contributions with optical clocks to international timescales. We need to increase the availability of links between the clocks. So that means more dedicated optical fiber links, and it also means making sure that those links are running in a robust and resilient way. And finally, we also need to improve our knowledge of local gravity potentials. Now, I haven't mentioned this so far, but Einstein's theory of relativity tells us that clocks at different heights and in different gravity potentials run at different rates. So if we're going to be comparing clocks and incorporating them into an international timescale, we need to take account of all the height differences between the clocks as well. Now, that's already done, of course, with the cesium clocks in the current timescales, but if we're going to be using optical clocks at 2 orders of magnitude better uncertainty, then we're going to have to know those gravity potentials correspondingly better as well. And then the last 2 criteria that we're going to have to satisfy before we redefine, these are really about making sure we take the right decision when redefining. So the first of these is to say we need to make sure the new definition is future-proof. We want to make sure it allows room to have more accurate realizations into the future. And we also need to make sure that the definition is accessible. So that means it needs to be understandable, and it means that users need to be able to access the new primary and secondary realizations of the second. So you can see there's really quite a lot of work going on, and as I said, we're hoping to be ready by 2030, and a new definition will allow us to have timescales that are based on more accurate clocks, and that will set us up to have much more accurate timescales into the future. And so that brings me to the summary. So I hope I've shown you that optical clocks can measure 1 second to an incredible precision, to within 1 part in 10 to the 18. We don't just hope that we've achieved that, we verify that we've achieved that by comparing optical clocks against optical clocks in other countries as well. And all of this is telling us that we need to have a new definition of the second, and there's a lot of work going on in the international community trying to get ourselves ready for that. The target date is 2030, and I guess it's going to be a case of watch this space to see if we achieve all of that. So thank you very much.